Not every Tekken character earns their spot on the roster. Some are forgettable, some are broken, and some feel like they were never meant to be there in the first place. In a franchise built on iconic fighters and decades of history, the gap between the best and the worst is massive. Today, I'm breaking down the worst characters in Tekken history and exactly what went wrong with each of them. Starting with a character who's been around for decades and still feels like they don't belong, Panda. Panda has been in this franchise since Tekken 3, which came out in 1997. That is nearly 30 years of roster slots, 30 years of development time, and the single most interesting thing anyone can say about her is that she weighs 200 kilograms, which has never once mattered competitively in any game at any level. Here's the thing, she is not mechanically bad. She is mechanically identical to Kuma, a character with an actual identity and an actual reason to exist. Panda shares Kuma's moveset almost entirely, right down to the grappling animations, with cosmetic changes in how she performs them. That is not a character. That is a palette swap that got a roster slot. In the time since Tekken 3, the franchise has produced 20+ playable fighters with developed stories, distinct styles, and actual reasons to be in the game. Panda has none of that. Her entire story across the franchise amounts to she is Ling Xiaoyu's pet and she hangs out. That is the complete file. And then Tekken 8 happened, and the developers seemingly ran out of things to say about her entirely. She was absent from the base roster and came back only as DLC, which is less a creative decision and more a formal acknowledgement that nobody could figure out what to do with her without just pointing at nostalgia and hoping for the best. The core problem was never that Panda is a bad character. It is that she has never been a character at all. If you think that is a depressing start, wait until you hear about Gon, a character so chaotic the entire legal system had to get involved. Gon. Panda has been in Tekken for nearly 30 years and shows zero signs of leaving. Gon, on the other hand, got one game, one specific version of that game, and then vanished completely. Not because players stopped liking him, because Tekken doesn't actually own him. Here's the thing, Gon is not a Tekken character. He never was. He's pulled directly from a separate anime and manga franchise, which means the only way he existed in Tekken 3's PlayStation version at all was through a licensing agreement that eventually expired. And once it expired, that was it. Gone. Legally locked out. Bandai Namco cannot bring him back even if they wanted to. And I don't know what to tell you about a franchise that accidentally adopted a character it could never legally keep. But the licensing situation is almost the least interesting part of this, because Gon was also just mechanically broken in the most chaotic possible way. He had only 12 unique animations, which, for context, is roughly the amount you'd expect from a character someone started building on a Friday and had to ship by Monday. His moveset was borrowed randomly from other fighters with no coherent style connecting any of it, and his hitbox, relative to his tiny frame, was so inconsistent that matches involving him stopped being about skill and started being about whether the collision detection felt like cooperating that day. His arcade ending sums up his entire relationship with the franchise perfectly. He finishes the tournament, returns to his own universe, and nothing about Tekken's story changes at all. He was a guest who never unpacked his bags. So, Gon exists now as this permanently locked away fever dream, a character Tekken can remember but never touch again, which is either poetic or just sad depending on how attached you were to him. If you think that's a rough legacy, wait until you hear about Dr. Boskanovich, a character Tekken actually owns and still somehow made unplayable on purpose. Dr. Boskanovich is not a character who tried to be good and fell short. He was engineered to be bad, shipped into 3 separate games across 15 years, and the developers looked at him each time and decided he was fine exactly as he was. That's either honesty or contempt. Possibly both. Here's the thing about Boskanovich. He was always designed as an unplayable character made playable, a reward for clearing a mode in Tekken 3, never intended for serious competition. The devs built him as a joke, and to their credit, they never pretended otherwise. What they also never did was fix him, or update him, or acknowledge that shipping a joke character 3 times across a decade and a half might start to feel less like a wink and more like a dare. The numbers are genuinely hard to process if you know anything about Tekken. His command grab, one of his primary offensive tools, deals 8 damage on hit. 8. In a franchise where a single well-executed combo can strip half a health bar in under 4 seconds, Boskanovich's signature move deals less damage than bumping into a wall. And that's not hyperbole, that's just the number. It sat there, untouched, across every single one of his playable appearances. His throwing animations involve him tripping over himself, and stumbling into the opponent, which is funny the first time. The second time, it's a little less funny. By the point you're watching it in a real match, it's basically a notification that you've made a serious error in judgment. 0 professional players have ever won a major tournament using Dr. Boskanovich. His competitive representation across the Tekken 3 era is a documented 0. Not low, not rare. 0. Some players tried to make him work, which is honestly kind of admirable in the same way that trying to win a marathon in flip-flops is admirable. You respect the commitment. You do not respect the outcome. The sharpest part of all of this is the intentionality. This isn't a character who slipped through quality control or got nerfed into the ground by a bad patch. He launched broken and stayed broken because being broken was the point. The joke was always on the players who tried to take him seriously. 3 games, 15 years, 8 damage. Roger Jr. is also a joke, but at least that one has fur. Roger Jr. Roger Jr. is not a bad character. He is a bad character twice. Here's the thing. When Tekken 2 introduced Roger, the boxing kangaroo, the community collectively shrugged and moved on. Fine, weird experiment. Happens. But then Tekken Tag Tournament brought Roger back into the fold, and rather than leave well enough alone, the series eventually doubled down with Roger Jr., a kangaroo who carries his father's fighting DNA and absolutely none of his father's novelty. And the result is a legacy of failure so consistent it almost becomes impressive. Almost. The reach problem alone should have ended this. Roger Jr. has the shortest reach of any fighter in every game he appears in, every single one. The practical consequence of this is that zoning is completely off the table, which means every match immediately collapses into a close quarters brawl, which is exactly the situation where his limitations are most exposed. Whoever designed this did not think it through, or did think it through and decided the kangaroo concept was worth the trade. Neither answer is good, the numbers make it worse. Roger Jr. has never finished higher than 4th place at a major regional tournament in over 25 years of competitive play. Not globally, not nationally, regionally. The character has been a bottom 10 pick in competitive viability rankings across every single appearance, without exception. And the community has been extremely consistent in that assessment for longer than some of the people playing Tekken have been alive. And then Tekken 7 left him out entirely. 0 community protest. 7 years of updates. They looked at the roster, looked at the request lists, and apparently decided that what the modern Tekken audience did not need was a kangaroo who hadn't worked in 1997, which is actually the correct call. It just says something deeply unflattering that the absence of a character is the best thing that ever happened to his reputation. Getting benched is not the same as getting better. 2 generations. Same idea, same result. Some families break the cycle. This is not one of them. If you think a kangaroo with no reach is a questionable design decision, just wait until you hear about a character whose entire gimmick is that he literally does not have a fighting style. 6 games, 0 wins, still invited back every single time. Mokuj Gojin is a wooden training dummy, not a character inspired by a training dummy, not someone who fights like one. A literal wooden training dummy with no face, no story, no agenda, who shuffles onto the roster every few years and proceeds to accomplish absolutely nothing. Here's the thing. The gimmick sounds interesting on paper. Mokujin randomly copies between 5 and 8 different character movesets per match, switching between them and forcing you to adapt on the fly. The idea is chaos. Unpredictability as a weapon. But here's the kicker. Unpredictability only works as a weapon if the person holding it can also aim. What actually happens is that Mokujin copies a moveset he has no business using, switches away before either player can capitalize, and then loses anyway. The randomness hurts him just as much as it hurts you. Fighting game competition is built entirely on matchup knowledge, execution, and read-based decision-making. Mokujin is fundamentally opposed to all 3 simultaneously, and he lives inside one of the most prestigious, competitive franchises in the genre. The results are exactly what you would expect. 0 documented wins at top-level tournament play, not 1. Across 6 games and roughly 26 years of competitive Tekken, nobody has ever taken a major tournament with Mokujin. That is not bad luck, that is physics. He was pulled entirely from Tekken 7, absent from the roster start to finish, which felt like the franchise finally admitting what everybody already knew. Then he was brought back for Tekken 8, which is genuinely baffling. Not because bringing him back was the wrong call emotionally, but because somebody at Bandai Namco looked at 6 straight games of competitive irrelevance and thought, yes, but what if 7? You almost have to respect it. Mokujin has failed upward with a consistency that most successful characters cannot match. He is the franchise's most loyal disaster. But if you think a wooden dummy with an identity crisis is frustrating, wait until we get to Miharu Hirano, a character who managed to be even more forgettable while actually being a real person. Miharu Hirano. Miharu Hirano is proof that you can build a character around a look, ship her in a full-price game, and still have absolutely nothing to say about why she exists. She debuted in Tekken 4 in 2001 as a teenage schoolgirl who shares her entire fighting style with Ling Xiaoyu, which sounds fine on paper until you notice that shares her entire fighting style with an existing character is doing a lot of heavy lifting where fighting game identity should be. Her moveset is Xiaoyu's Phoenix-style Kung Fu and Baguazhang, just reassigned to a different face with a different uniform. She looks a certain way. That was the brief. That was apparently also the completion. Here's the thing with Miharu. She is a direct clone character in a franchise that had every opportunity to not do that. The minor hitbox differences that exist between her and Xiaoyu were small enough that competitive players essentially treated them as the same character. Except one of them was Xiaoyu, who the developers actually cared about developing further. Miharu's technical identity amounted to aesthetic variation on top of someone else's work. She was a palette swap that got a slot on the roster, and the slot was the entirety of the investment. But here's where it gets more telling than the mechanical overlap. After Tekken 4, Miharu simply stopped appearing. She was absent from Tekken 5, absent from Tekken 6, and didn't return until Tekken Tag Tournament 2, a non-canonical crossover entry where nothing technically has to count. That gap tells you everything. The developers built her, shipped her, looked at what they had made, and apparently decided the kindest thing to do was quietly change the subject. Miharu represents something specific about Tekken's early 2000s design instincts. The franchise was experimenting with younger, more aesthetically driven characters, chasing a visual appeal without a design philosophy to support it. The question of why this character would enter an international fighting tournament, what she wants, what she brings mechanically that Xiaoyu doesn't already bring. Those questions went unanswered because they were never really asked. She was built to look a certain way, and everything else was left as an exercise for someone who never showed up. The result is a character who never had a foundation, got exactly as far as that could take her, and then quietly stopped being a priority. Zafina had a foundation. It just didn't work. Zafina. Zafina is one of the rare fighting game characters who got a second chance, blew it, and somehow made the whole situation more confusing by doing so. She debuted in Tekken 6 with a fighting style built around backward-facing stances, contorted body positions, and an aesthetic clearly inspired by Egyptian astrology. Visually distinctive, narratively interesting, different enough from the rest of the roster to justify her existence. The problem is that those backward stances created measurable input lag. Community frame data analysis put the gap at somewhere between 4 and 6 additional frames compared to traditional fighting styles. 4 to 6 frames is not a rounding error. In a game where single frame execution separates wins from losses at high level, that's not a quirk. That's a structural disadvantage baked into her core mechanics from day one. The results were predictable. She ranked 32nd out of 41 characters in Tekken 6. She had fewer than 50 documented tournament placements across her entire run in Tekken 6 and Tekken 7 combined. Top-tier characters regularly accumulate more than 500 placements per game. Zafina, across 2 full game entries, spanning nearly a decade, couldn't break 50 total. That's not a character falling short. That's a character essentially not existing at the competitive level. Here's where it gets interesting. The developers agreed, quietly but clearly. For Tekken 7, Zafina received a complete animation overhaul. Not a balance pass, not a few frame adjustments, a full rebuild. Players who had spent years learning her moveset had to start from scratch. That kind of intervention is rare, and it means something. It's as close as a fighting game developer gets to officially admitting a character was fundamentally broken. And then she shipped out of that overhaul and still ranked 28th out of 34 characters in Tekken 7. Still failed to break into competitive relevance, which raises a genuinely uncomfortable question. Was the problem the design or the concept? Because there's a version of this story where a bad design gets fixed and a character thrives. Zafina is not that story. She got rebuilt from the ground up, players relearned everything, and the competitive outcomes barely moved. At some point, the evidence suggests that the backward stances, the contorted positioning, the fundamental philosophy of how she plays might just not work at the level the rest of the roster operates. 2 entries, 1 major rebuild, 0 competitive relevance. That's a more damning verdict than simply releasing a bad character and moving on. At least Zafina had a distinct identity underneath the problems. Gigas didn't even get that far. Gigas weighs 290 kilograms and has the narrative footprint of a background NPC in someone else's cutscene. Here's the thing about Gigas. He was introduced in Tekken 7 as a super heavyweight brawler with slow, deliberate mechanics, which in a fast-paced fighter basically translates to, you will get hit first, you will get hit a lot, and the person hitting you will be having a significantly better time than you are. The community ran the numbers and placed him 39th out of 44 characters, which is already bad. But then, a 2017 balance patch came through, and Gigas received exactly one meaningful change across the entire thing. 1. The developers looked at a 290 kilogram monster sitting at the bottom of a tier list and decided, you know what, that's probably fine. It wasn't fine. He never climbed. Fewer than 30 tournament top 8 placements across 9 years of competitive Tekken 7 play, making him one of the least represented launch characters in the game's entire history. To put that in perspective, some characters had that many placements in a single major regional event. Gigas had that many across nearly a decade of competitive play. And this wasn't a case of a niche character finding a devoted specialist community that quietly kept him alive. There was no Gigas revolution happening offline, no cult following that just didn't show up in the data. The data was the whole story, but the real damage is the lore. In a franchise built on multi-generational revenge plots, family betrayal arcs, and Devil Gene mythology spanning decades, Gigas appeared in one 90-second cutscene in Tekken 7's arcade mode, stood near Kazuya for a moment, and was never referenced again. Not in a follow-up scene, not in someone else's ending, not even a throwaway line in a cinematic he happened to be standing near. He just ceased to exist narratively, which is an impressive achievement for a character who weighs as much as a small car and theoretically should be difficult to overlook. And if that weren't enough, his animations are largely shared with Jack 6 and other heavy character archetypes. So he doesn't move like a unique fighter with a distinct identity built from the ground up. He moves like a reskin that got approved somewhere between a Tuesday afternoon meeting and someone leaving early for lunch. The leading theory is that the development team either considered him resolved after that single patch or quietly moved on and hoped nobody would notice. Given that almost nobody plays him, it mostly worked. Katarina Alves at least tried to be something, which is a sentence that passes for a compliment around here. Katarina Alves. Here's a rare thing, a character who failed at every single audience simultaneously. Katarina Alves was introduced in Tekken 7 as a deliberately casual-friendly fighter. The idea was that her footsies-focused, spacing-based playstyle would give newcomers something approachable in a game that otherwise punishes ignorance with immediate death. Noble goal, terrible execution. Because Tekken is a fast, pressure-heavy, get-in-your-face kind of game, and designing a character around patient ground control for that game is like bringing a chess clock to a boxing match. She didn't fit the system. The system didn't bend for her, so casual players bounced off her because she didn't actually feel simple to use. And competitive players ignored her because her playstyle was fundamentally incompatible with how high-level Tekken works. The numbers are brutal. Katarina consistently sat near the bottom of competitive tier lists throughout Tekken 7's lifespan. She had almost zero representation at major tournaments across her run. Top players documented her as one of the least picked characters at high-level events, with barely any top 8 tournament appearances to her name across years of competitive play. That's a brutal figure for any launch character, let alone one that was supposed to serve as an entry point for new players. Not the lowest in some narrow category. Just quietly, consistently, almost invisible at the top level. And it's not like she had a rich story to compensate. Her entire canonical presence across the franchise amounted to her Tekken 7 arcade mode story, and a handful of interactions that told you almost nothing about who she actually was. She showed up, said some things, and left. That was it. Years of being on the roster, and the writers never seemed to find anything particularly interesting to do with her. Then, Tekken 8 launched, and Katarina wasn't on the roster. No explanation from the developers, no statement, no narrative send-off. She wasn't killed off in the story or written out in any meaningful way. She just wasn't there anymore. That's actually the worst version of a character's ending. Getting killed off is at least acknowledgement that you existed. What happened to Katarina is that the franchise quietly decided to stop including her, offered no reason, and moved on. She wasn't retired, she was just absent. The developers apparently concluded that the most dignified option was to say nothing at all, which tells you everything about how much they believed in the character they designed. A double failure with a silent exit, which is, Not ideal. Shaheen had a similar problem, but his situation comes with its own specific flavor of disappointment. Shaheen was added to Tekken 7 as part of the game's push for international diversity, a Saudi Arabian military operative with a clean design, a recognizable aesthetic, and absolutely nothing else going on. Here's the thing. The idea of broadening Tekken's roster to better reflect a global audience is genuinely good. Nobody's arguing against that. But representation only means something if the character you create has an actual identity underneath the flag you're waving, and Shaheen did not have that. Mechanically, he shared fundamental movement and striking patterns with multiple characters already on the roster at launch. In a game he was brand new to, you could swap him out for several other fighters and barely notice the difference, which is a brutal thing to say about someone who was supposed to be a fresh addition. He wasn't a character, he was a character-shaped space where a character could have been. The competitive reception backed this up without mercy. Shaheen launched into a crowded roster and spent years hovering in the lower half of tier lists. Never quite bad enough to be interesting, and never good enough to be relevant. Tekken 7's final balance patch landed in 2021, and after years of developer attention, the net result was a character who had barely moved in any meaningful direction. Quietly, gradually, without anyone really noticing, which might actually be the most Shaheen thing possible. His tournament presence across Tekken 7's lifespan was minimal at best. Not a rough stretch, not a down period, a character so thoroughly ignored by serious players that you could build an entire career in competitive Tekken and never once have to think about what Shaheen does. That kind of absence doesn't happen by accident. It accumulates through years of players collectively deciding there's just nothing here worth investing in. His story presence was just as thin. He got a single arcade mode cutscene with no established motivation, no character arc, and no follow-up anywhere in the game. Tekken 7 introduced him, noted his existence, and immediately moved on. No mystery, no development, no payoff hidden somewhere in the lore. He arrived, stood in the corner, and the story walked past him without making eye contact. The real tragedy of Shaheen isn't that he was bad. It's that he was created specifically to mean something, to represent a region and a culture and a community that genuinely wanted to see themselves in this franchise, and the execution was so hollow that he ended up representing nothing at all. A checkbox dressed up as a character. The intent was right, and the result was empty, which is somehow worse than just getting it wrong. If you think Invisible is bad, Lucky Chloe managed the opposite problem entirely, and somehow made people wish she was invisible instead. Lucky Chloe. Lucky Chloe is the only character on this list who managed to fail twice, once before anyone had played her, and then again after they did. That's a specific kind of achievement, and not the good kind. When Bandai Namco announced Lucky Chloe ahead of Tekken 7's release, the reaction was immediate and not subtle. Thousands of negative forum posts flooded in within the first week. Not after release, after the announcement, before a single person had touched her moveset, loaded into a match, or done anything other than look at her and form an opinion. The K-pop idol aesthetic, the cat ears, the anime-adjacent visual design sitting next to a franchise built around grounded martial artists, throwing each other through walls. The community decided that was a problem, and here's the thing. The community was not entirely wrong about the aesthetic clash. Tekken's identity has always been rooted in a specific kind of gritty realism. You have boxers, wrestlers, military operatives, a literal demon king, and then you have Lucky Chloe doing a dance routine. That tension is real, and it never really resolved across multiple game entries. She never stopped looking like she wandered in from a different franchise entirely. But here's where it gets interesting. The backlash being aesthetic only would have been easy to dismiss. Some people just don't like new things as a comfortable narrative. Except then, she shipped, people played her, and the competitive numbers came in. She sat near the bottom of Tekken 7's tier lists for the better part of her lifespan, with essentially no meaningful tournament presence in her early years. The crowd that had spent a week arguing she didn't belong in Tekken turned out to also be correct that she didn't work in Tekken, which felt less like validation and more like a punchline. The backlash at announcement was loud enough that it became an industry news story, not just a forum thread. That's an unusual threshold for a fighting game character review. Individual community members complaining is entirely normal. The volume and speed of organized discontent reaching gaming media coverage is a different category entirely, so you'd expect some kind of response. A rework, a significant redesign, maybe a quiet removal. What you did not expect was for Lucky Chloe to be absent from Tekken 8's base roster entirely, effectively shelved after one mainline entry, which, depending on how you look at it, is either a quiet admission or just a casualty of roster cuts. Either way, the conversation her absence sparked was just as loud as the one her presence started. Lucky Chloe remains Tekken's biggest flashpoint. Not the worst character mechanically, not the most narratively empty, but the one whose existence the community has never fully agreed on. That unresolved tension is what puts her this close to the end of this list. But if you thought that was a divisive addition to the roster, Tekken 8 had another one ready to go: Azucena. Here's the thing about Azucena. She is not the worst character on this list. That's not a defense. It's almost the opposite. Azucena debuted in Tekken 8 in January 2024 and landed in the upper tier brackets immediately, with competitive players slotting her into S tier and higher tier in early post-launch rankings. Strong neutral game, good range, stance transitions that looked dangerous on paper. The developers looked at that early placement and apparently decided the solution was to start trimming. Patch 1.04 in May 2024 came with nerfs. More adjustments followed. By the end of her first year, the character who launched as a top-tier threat had been systematically walked back to somewhere considerably less interesting, which is its own kind of commentary on how the development team responds to success. Her stance-switching mechanics were the thing competitive analysts kept coming back to. The system has more moving parts than it has outcomes. You invest time learning to navigate between stances, and what you get back does not match what you put in. That specific failure mode is almost invisible in a tier list because it does not show up as a number. It shows up as the feeling you get 20 hours into learning a character when you realize the complexity was never going anywhere. It was just complexity. The nerfs made that ceiling lower without making the floor any more interesting. Her story role was a single prologue cutscene. No development, no arc, no reason to care about her beyond the visual branding. Tekken 7 and 8 have both done this repeatedly, building new characters around a striking aesthetic and then leaving the actual person completely hollow behind it. Azucena looks like someone had a strong pitch meeting. Then the meeting ended and nobody followed up. What makes her the right note to end on is that none of this is spectacular. She is not Dr. Boskanovich, designed as a joke and shipped as a punchline. She is not Lucky Chloe, controversial enough to generate genuine emotional investment from thousands of people who hated her. She is not Gigas, a filler character so obviously unfinished it almost becomes interesting on those terms. Azucena is what you get when a franchise launches something that works, panics slightly that it works too well, and patches it into something nobody feels strongly about either way. She was trimmed to land somewhere acceptable, she did, and that is genuinely the most damning thing you can say about a character. At least the disasters were interesting. At least they made you feel something, even if that something was complete bewilderment. Azucena makes you feel roughly nothing, and she will continue doing that for however long she stays on the roster, competently occupying a slot, neither rising nor falling, permanently fine. Mid-tier mediocrity might be harder to forgive than spectacular failure. Failure at least implies someone was swinging for something. This is what happens when the goal becomes damage control, and apparently, for a franchise this old, that is sometimes good enough. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.